A luxurious five-star restaurant, bustling with high-profile guests, radiated wealth and prestige. Among them sat a billionaire businessman, Richard Sterling, a man known for his arrogance and sharp tongue. Dressed in an expensive tailored suit, he observed everyone around him with a judgmental eye. At the far corner of the restaurant, a tall, well-built man in a simple hoodie and sweatpants quietly took a seat. His calm demeanor contrasted with the extravagance surrounding him. Richard glanced at him, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "Looks like someone wandered in from the streets," he muttered to himself, smirking. The wealthy guests around Richard chuckled in agreement, their laughter fueled by their shared sense of superiority. None of them realized that the man they were mocking was one of the greatest basketball legends of all time, LeBron James. As LeBron picked up a menu, completely unfazed by the stares and whispers, Richard leaned back in his chair, already planning to have some fun at the poor man's expense. Before the story unfolds, if you're enjoying this so far, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There are more inspiring and eye-opening stories like this coming your way. Now, let's continue. Richard Sterling couldn't help but chuckle as LeBron ordered a simple meal, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's incredible," Richard said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Even in a place like this, some people have no sense of style or class. The surrounding diners glanced at LeBron, some nodding in agreement, others unsure of what to think. Richard, feeling emboldened by the attention, leaned closer to a waiter. "You should be careful who you allow in here. People like that don't belong in a fine establishment," he said with a smirk. The waiter, sensing the tension, nervously glanced at LeBron but said nothing. Richard's voice carried over the room, his words dripping with condescension. "Look at him. No regard for appearances, no taste. How does someone like that even make it in life?" LeBron, sitting calmly, paid no attention to the insults being thrown his way. His focus was on the menu, his demeanor as collected as ever. But inside, the gears of his mind began to turn, and he knew exactly what was happening. Richard's mocking tone filled the air, but no one expected what would come next. Before the crowd could react further, the atmosphere shifted. As Richard continued his tirade, his words grew louder and more pointed. "It's embarrassing, really," he scoffed. "A place like this, and he thinks he can just walk in here dressed like that. It's as if he doesn't know what quality means." The other patrons in the restaurant shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding eye contact with LeBron, while others exchanged nervous glances. It was clear that Richard's words were designed to belittle, to make LeBron feel small. And yet, LeBron remained composed, his calmness almost irritating to Richard, who could not fathom why his insults weren't having the desired effect. Richard leaned in closer, making sure his voice carried. "I bet he doesn't even know how to properly use a fork and knife. What a joke." The crowd around him began to murmur, some chuckling awkwardly, while others seemed uncertain. But LeBron, unfazed by the barrage of insults, glanced up from his menu, meeting Richard's gaze for the first time. His expression was unreadable, his eyes calm, almost distant. Instead of reacting angrily or getting upset, he simply smiled softly. Richard's smug grin faltered for a split second. It was as if LeBron had seen through him, unbothered, unshaken, completely immune to the ridicule. It was a moment that left the air tense, but Richard didn't back down. He just couldn't help himself, still convinced that his wealth and status gave him the right to put others down. LeBron's eyes remained steady as Richard continued his verbal assault. But rather than looking upset or angry, LeBron's demeanor only became more intriguing. He didn't feel the need to defend himself. Instead, he let his silence speak volumes. Richard, now growing frustrated, couldn't understand why LeBron wasn't reacting the way he expected. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his voice dripping with even more disdain. "You're not even worth the effort of mocking. Look at you, just another guy who got lucky. You think you belong here?" The restaurant fell into an awkward silence as the words hung in the air. But LeBron finally spoke, his voice calm and steady, with no trace of defensiveness. "I don't need to belong anywhere but where I am," he said quietly, his words almost philosophical. "People like you might judge others based on what they wear or how they look, but I don't let those things define who I am." Richard, caught off guard, blinked in surprise. He had expected LeBron to get angry, to lash out, but instead he was met with a reflection of the very values Richard had spent his life ignoring: humility, grace, and a sense of self-worth beyond material wealth. For a brief moment the tables were turned. Richard found himself questioning why this man, who had been subjected to so much ridicule, was so unwavering in his composure. His arrogance began to falter as the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. LeBron's simple words had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. Before the tension could build, LeBron leaned back slightly in his chair and smiled, a subtle but knowing smile that carried with it the weight of someone who had been through far more than the superficial judgments of a wealthy businessman. The atmosphere in the restaurant had changed. Richard, still puzzled by LeBron's unshakable calmness, sat in silence, unsure of what to make of the situation. The other patrons, once eagerly following Richard's mocking, began to look uncomfortable. Some glanced at LeBron with newfound respect, while others whispered among themselves, unsure whether they should have joined in on the ridicule. But what no one expected was the subtle shift that began to take place around them. As LeBron remained composed, a few guests, clearly recognizing him, started to murmur amongst themselves. One woman in the corner leaned over to her friend and whispered, "Wait, isn't that LeBron James?" The friend squinted in disbelief. "No way, it can't be him, can it?" A few seconds passed, and then another voice spoke up. "It is him, that's definitely LeBron. He's just dressed down today." Richard didn't notice the shift at first. He was too busy stewing in his own sense of superiority, oblivious to the rising murmurs around him. But as more people began to recognize LeBron, the energy in the room began to change. Suddenly, the waitstaff, who had been trying to avoid the situation, started to gather near LeBron's table. One of them approached him and said, "Excuse me, Mr. James, is everything to your liking?" Richard's face contorted in confusion. "Wait, James, as in LeBron James?" The reality of the situation hit Richard like a ton of bricks, but it was too late. The people around him, who had once been entertained by his insults, now looked at him with judgment. They could see that the man he had been belittling was a global icon, someone who had achieved more in his life than Richard could dream of. Richard's ego began to crack. He had insulted not just anyone, but one of the most respected and accomplished athletes in the world. Richard sat in stunned silence as the realization slowly dawned on him. The whispers around him grew louder, and he finally turned to look at LeBron, who sat quietly, still unfazed by the growing attention. The change in atmosphere was palpable. People were no longer watching out of curiosity or amusement. Now, they were looking at Richard as if he were the one out of place. LeBron, sensing the shift, didn't make a scene. Instead, he continued eating his meal, maintaining his calm and collected presence. Richard, feeling both embarrassed and foolish, finally spoke, his voice laced with a forced chuckle. I had no idea you were that LeBron James." LeBron looked up, meeting Richard's gaze, and with a slight knowing smile he responded, "I figured as much." His tone wasn't one of arrogance or smugness, but one of quiet understanding. It happens a lot. People don't always see beyond the surface. Richard's face turned a shade redder as the weight of his words came crashing down. All around him, the patrons were now staring at him with a mix of disbelief and subtle pity. The harsh, mocking remarks he had thrown at LeBron earlier seemed even more cruel in this light. LeBron, without missing a beat, added, "But it's okay. I'm not here to prove anything to anyone. I've spent my life doing what I love, and I know what I'm worth. I don't need approval from people who don't know me." For a moment, the room was silent. The message was clear. LeBron wasn't defined by what he wore or what others thought of him. He had earned his place in the world through hard work, dedication, and a character that couldn't be touched by shallow judgments. Richard's arrogance seemed to deflate in the face of LeBron's unshakable confidence. He was no longer the center of attention. In fact, people around him started to look at him differently, questioning his own values, his own sense of self. This wasn't just a lesson for Richard, it was a lesson for everyone in that restaurant. Sometimes the truth isn't always what it seems on the outside. As Richard's mind raced, trying to process the situation, the reactions from the people around him began to shift. The smug expressions that had once accompanied his insults were now replaced with discomfort. Some guests who had previously chuckled along with Richard now exchanged awkward glances, realizing the depth of his mistake. A young woman seated nearby leaned over to her companion, whispering, "I can't believe he actually said those things. And to LeBron, of all people, he's a legend." Her voice carried a mixture of surprise and admiration for LeBron's calmness in the face of such disrespect. An older gentleman at another table shook his head, muttering, "The man has no idea who he's talking to." His voice was low, but his words rang with the kind of wisdom that comes with age and experience, wisdom Richard had yet to acquire. One of the waiters, who had been standing off to the side, caught LeBron's eye and smiled, offering a subtle nod of respect. "It's a shame how people judge based on appearances," the waiter said quietly to his colleague, but loud enough for Richard to overhear. "He's a king, not just on the court, but in how he carries himself." Richard, now growing more uncomfortable by the second, couldn't escape the rising tide of judgment around him. The looks of pity and disdain were clear, and the weight of his earlier insults was beginning to crush him. His self-assurance, once so solid, now felt fragile and hollow. LeBron, still unbothered, simply continued to enjoy his meal, unaware, or perhaps deliberately indifferent, to the stares of the restaurant's patrons. His quiet dignity spoke louder than any words Richard had thrown at him. The people around them were now far more focused on LeBron's poise and character than on the foolishness of the man who had tried to put him down. As the whispers grew louder and more guests began to realize who LeBron was, Richard felt the walls closing in on him. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to ignore the growing awareness of his blunder. The light-hearted murmurs he had once ignited were now replaced by a deeper, more meaningful conversation about respect, dignity, and the consequences of making assumptions. One of the diners who had been sitting nearby stood up and approached LeBron's table. With a respectful nod, he said, "Mr. James, I've been following your career for years. I just wanted to say, I have so much respect for not just what you do on the court, but for everything you've done off it, too." LeBron smiled kindly, nodding in acknowledgement. "Thank you, I appreciate that." Richard, now flustered, could feel the shift in the room. People were no longer paying attention to him. All eyes were on LeBron, and not just because of his celebrity, but because of how he carried himself, his humility, his calm, his ability to rise above the petty judgments of others. Another person, an older man sitting nearby, piped up, "I've seen you in the media, Mr. James. Your work in the community is more impressive than anything you've done in basketball." LeBron's smile deepened. "I try to give back whenever I can. The game gave me everything, so I owe it to people to do more with the platform I've been given." Richard's face grew hotter as the truth began to dawn on him. LeBron wasn't just an athlete. He was a leader, a philanthropist, and a role model. His achievements went far beyond his fame, and yet Richard had reduced him to a mere target for mockery. The deeper the conversation about LeBron's life and impact went, the more Richard's arrogance deflated. It was clear that the man he had mocked was far more influential, accomplished, and respected than he could ever hope to be. The truth about LeBron's character was undeniable, and it was now clear to everyone in the room. Richard's discomfort grew as more and more people around him acknowledged LeBron's contributions and greatness, slowly turning the focus away from his insults and back to the remarkable individual he had disrespected. Despite the growing realization of his mistake, Richard couldn't help but cling to his pride. As the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted, with more guests turning their attention to LeBron, Richard's ego refused to let go. He had built his entire life on being superior, and in this moment, he wasn't ready to admit that someone else had shown him up. With a strained smile, Richard leaned forward and said, "Look, I wasn't trying to be disrespectful. His voice trailed off as he searched for words that could somehow redeem him, but his pride wouldn't allow him to offer a genuine apology. Instead, he tried to justify his behavior. "It's just that people like you," he started, his tone slightly condescending. "You get so much attention, so much praise, and it's hard for someone who's worked for everything to understand why." His attempt at salvaging his dignity only made matters worse. The crowd around him grew more uncomfortable as they recognized the arrogance in his words. They saw the truth of the matter. Richard wasn't just embarrassed. He was unwilling to face the consequences of his actions. LeBron, still calm and collected, looked at Richard for a moment, his expression neutral. "I get it," he said softly. "It's hard when you've worked so hard for what you have, but that doesn't mean others don't deserve respect. It's not about who has more, it's about how you treat people." Richard's face tightened. He could feel the tension rising in the room, but instead of reflecting on LeBron's words, he tried to force the conversation back onto his terms. "I just don't see how someone like you can have it all, and still be treated like you're untouchable." The crowd, however, was no longer on Richard's side. The more he tried to defend his pride, the more they saw him as the true arrogant one, refusing to acknowledge his mistake. They could see the contrast between LeBron's humility and Richard's desperate attempts to hold on to his inflated sense of superiority. The room fell silent once again, and it became clear. Richard's ego was the true barrier preventing him from seeing the bigger picture. LeBron's calm demeanor never faltered as Richard continued his misguided attempts at justifying his earlier behavior. But now, there was something different in the air. LeBron had been patient, understanding, and composed throughout the ordeal, but there was a subtle shift in his energy. He wasn't angry, but the quiet strength in his voice grew firmer, more assertive. LeBron set his fork down slowly, his eyes locking with Richard's. There was a moment of complete silence between them, and the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. For the first time, Richard realized that LeBron wasn't just a basketball legend. He was a man who had learned how to handle pressure and negativity with dignity. "I don't need to explain myself to you," LeBron said, his voice low but resolute. "I've worked hard for everything I have. I've faced more than you could ever imagine, on and off the court. But at the end of the day, it's not about the trophies or the fame. It's about how you treat people. Richard, still unable to admit his error, opened his mouth to argue. But LeBron held up a hand, signaling for him to stop. You can keep defending your pride, but it's not going to change what just happened. You thought you could tear me down, but all you did was show the world exactly who you are. And trust me, the world is watching. The words hit Richard harder than any insult he had thrown earlier. LeBron wasn't just defending himself. He was teaching him a lesson about character, humility, and what truly matters in life. The restaurant, which had been tense with anticipation, seemed to relax, as if everyone collectively exhaled. LeBron's words were a powerful reminder that true strength wasn't about wealth or status. It was about how you chose to rise above negativity and show grace in the face of disrespect. Richard's arrogance had finally met its match. His attempt to undermine LeBron had backfired in the most profound way. And now, the entire room could see that, in the battle of egos, it wasn't money or fame that mattered. It was the character you displayed when no one was watching. As the tension between LeBron and Richard hung in the air, something unexpected happened. Just as Richard was about to speak again, a figure walked into the restaurant. It wasn't just any person. It was another well-known individual, someone who had seen everything unfold from the moment they entered. It was a young man, a former basketball player who had once been a rival of LeBron's. Richard, still lost in his own ego, didn't recognize him immediately. But as soon as the man approached LeBron's table, the energy in the room shifted again. The former player, now a successful entrepreneur, greeted LeBron with a wide smile. "LeBron, my man, I haven't seen you in forever," he said, extending a hand to shake. LeBron stood up, smiling back. "Good to see you. Been a while." Richard, still processing the conversation, couldn't help but feel a pang of curiosity. "Who is that?" he whispered to the waiter nearby. The waiter, recognizing the opportunity to add a bit of intrigue to the moment, leaned in and whispered back, "That's Anthony Johnson. He was one of the biggest stars in the league before he retired. Went on to become a millionaire in business. He's had his ups and downs, but he's always respected LeBron." Richard's eyes widened in disbelief. Here was another titan of the sports world, someone who had built a legacy of his own, showing admiration and respect for the man he had so foolishly mocked. As the two men chatted, Anthony glanced at Richard, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're the guy who tried to put LeBron down earlier, aren't you?" His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. Richard, his confidence now shattered, tried to laugh it off, but it came out awkwardly. I didn't mean it. I was just having a bad day." Anthony smiled wryly. "Well, looks like your bad day just got a whole lot worse. You might want to rethink how you approach people moving forward." The truth was clear now. Richard wasn't just facing LeBron's strength. He was facing the consequences of his actions, and this was only the beginning of a series of events that would change his life. As Richard sat there, still reeling from the interactions with LeBron and Anthony, he noticed something strange. The once quiet and composed environment had become charged with anticipation. People were whispering and glancing at him, some with curiosity, others with pity. But then, just as Richard thought the situation couldn't get any worse, Anthony leaned in closer, his voice low enough for only the few closest to hear. "You don't get it, do you?" Anthony said, his words carrying an undertone of something more significant than just a casual conversation. "LeBron here is not just a basketball player. He's not just some guy you can talk down to." Richard, still grappling with his pride and his rapidly crumbling ego, frowned. "What are you talking about?" he muttered, trying to brush off the words as another attempt to make him feel small. But Anthony's next words hit harder than anything Richard could have anticipated. You see, LeBron's investments, his business moves, his charity work, his ability to build a legacy beyond basketball, they're worth more than your entire portfolio. And here's the kicker, Anthony continued, leaning back in his chair with a knowing smirk. That's not even the half of it. LeBron owns this restaurant. Richard's jaw dropped. The restaurant they were sitting in, the very same one where he had tried to insult LeBron, was owned by him? It was the last thing he had expected to hear. He thought of the grandeur of the place, the impeccable service, the reputation it had in the city, and suddenly everything clicked into place. LeBron, who had remained so calm and composed throughout, now looked at Richard with a knowing smile, his eyes full of quiet amusement. It's easy to get lost in your own world, thinking you know how everything works, but the truth is, sometimes you don't realize what's right in front of you until it's too late. Richard, feeling completely exposed now, couldn't even muster a response. The truth was undeniable. He had been insulting someone who was far more powerful, influential, and successful than he could ever imagine. And now, that reality was staring him in the face. The truth wasn't just about LeBron's achievements. It was about the people who failed to recognize them and what it meant for their own character. Richard's arrogance had blinded him, and now the full weight of his actions was crashing down on him. Richard sat there, completely speechless. The room seemed to blur around him as he processed the shocking truth. He had insulted not just any ordinary man, but the owner of the very restaurant they were in, the man who had built an empire and was silently watching him crumble under the weight of his own arrogance. For the first time, Richard felt small. His wealth, his status, his entire identity, all of it seemed so irrelevant in this moment. LeBron's quiet strength and humility were a stark contrast to his own inflated sense of superiority. The realization was humbling. Despite the overwhelming silence, Richard felt a strong, undeniable urge to defend himself. But as the words formed in his mind, he realized there was nothing left to say. How could he defend the insults he had thrown at a man who was not just successful, but a role model, a leader, and a force for good in the world? LeBron watched him carefully, his expression calm but firm. Richard, now visibly shaken, tried to gather his thoughts, but found himself at a loss. I didn't mean to offend you," he finally said, his voice shaky. I didn't know." LeBron smiled softly, his eyes filled with understanding, but also a touch of disappointment. "It's not about whether you knew or not," LeBron said gently. "It's about how you choose to treat people, regardless of who they are. The world is full of people who want to tear others down. The real test is whether you can rise above that and not let it define you." Richard swallowed hard. He knew deep down that LeBron was right. His wealth, his status, none of it meant anything if he couldn't even show basic respect for another person. He had spent so much of his life trying to be the one on top, but in doing so he had failed to see the bigger picture, the value of kindness, humility, and treating others with dignity. As LeBron stood up to leave, he placed a hand on Richard's shoulder, offering a final, quiet piece of advice. Success is about more than money or fame. It's about how you impact others, how you lift people up, and how you choose to make the world better. Richard watched him walk away, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he needed to change, and he realized that change started with him. His mindset, his actions, and the way he saw the world. As Richard sat there, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened, the restaurant, which had once felt like his domain, now felt cold and distant. His thoughts were interrupted when Anthony, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, leaned over and whispered, "I bet you didn't know the full story, did you?" Richard, still shaken, looked up at him, trying to process the layers of truth that had been unfolding. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Anthony gave him a knowing smile. LeBron didn't just randomly walk into this place. He built it from the ground up. He's been quietly investing in restaurants and other businesses for years now. But that's not the part you're missing. Anthony paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The real story is what he's done with his wealth and influence behind the scenes. Richard's brow furrowed as he tried to keep up. "I don't understand." LeBron doesn't just use his platform to make money for himself. He's been funding scholarships for underprivileged kids, opening schools, providing health care and opportunities to people who have nothing. And the people who work for him, they're like family. He's not just investing in businesses, he's investing in lives, in futures, in change. Richard's heart sank. He had spent his entire life judging success by the number of zeros in a bank account, by the flashy cars and exclusive clubs. But what he didn't understand, what he hadn't understood until this moment, was that LeBron's true success wasn't measured in material wealth. It was measured in the lives he had impacted, the difference he had made for people who would never have the opportunities Richard took for granted. LeBron wasn't just a symbol of athletic greatness. He was a symbol of hope, a symbol of purpose, a symbol of someone who used his platform not for self-glorification, but for the betterment of others. The realization hit Richard like a ton of bricks. He had tried to insult a man who had given more to the world than Richard could even imagine. And here he was, wallowing in his own self-centered pride. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt completely humbled. He had no words, no defense for the foolishness he had displayed. His pride had led him down a path that now felt so meaningless compared to the truth that had just been revealed. LeBron had shown him not just the power of wealth, but the power of compassion, integrity, and the responsibility that came with success. And Richard knew deep down that his life would never be the same again. As the weight of the truth settled over Richard, he couldn't help but feel a profound shift in his own perspective. The man he had tried to belittle wasn't just a famous athlete. He was someone who had used his platform to change lives, something Richard had never truly understood until now. It wasn't just about LeBron's wealth or fame anymore. It was about the impact he had made. Richard's mind raced as he replayed every interaction from the moment he first insulted LeBron. What had he been thinking? Why had he been so quick to judge someone based on superficial notions of success? He stood up, looking around the room, suddenly feeling very small. The restaurant, once a symbol of his own status, now felt like a reflection of everything he had been blind to. His wealth didn't matter anymore. His arrogance had only distanced him from what truly mattered: human connection and integrity. As the evening wore on, Richard couldn't shake the need to do something to make it right. He knew that words alone wouldn't fix the damage he had caused. So he approached the staff and asked if he could speak to LeBron one more time. When LeBron walked into the private room where Richard was waiting, the atmosphere was different. There was no anger, no resentment in Richard's eyes, just a genuine desire to make amends. "I owe you an apology," Richard began, his voice steady but filled with regret. "Earlier, I acted out of ignorance, and I'm sorry for the disrespect I showed you. I didn't understand who you were, what you stand for, or the impact you've had. I thought success was about the wrong things, money, status, but now I see that it's about how you use your influence to uplift others." LeBron, who had been silent for a moment, smiled warmly. "It's all good, Richard. We all have our moments. What matters is that you see things differently now, and you're willing to learn from it." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of LeBron's forgiveness. It wasn't just about the apology, it was about the change in his heart. He had been so caught up in his own ego, so blinded by his wealth, that he had forgotten the most important part of success: compassion. "You're right," Richard said, his voice stronger now. "I've spent my life building a fortune, but I've ignored the responsibility that comes with it. I want to be better, not just for myself, but for the people who look up to me. I want to make a real difference." LeBron placed a hand on Richard's shoulder, his expression genuine. "It's a process, Richard. But if you keep that mindset, you'll get there." Richard left the restaurant that night a changed man. He knew that it would take time to undo the damage he had done, but for the first time, he understood the true meaning of success. It wasn't just about how much you had. It was about how much you gave. As the days passed, Richard couldn't escape the lessons he had learned that night. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw a man who had been humbled by his own arrogance, someone who had allowed pride and shallow perceptions to dictate his actions. But now, there was something different. There was a clarity in his mind, a sense of responsibility he had never felt before. Richard had spent years building his wealth and status, thinking that those were the things that defined him. But now, he understood that true success was measured by the lives you touched, the people you helped, and the legacy you left behind. The realization was both powerful and painful, because he knew he had wasted so much time focusing on the wrong things. He spent the following weeks reflecting on his actions and the choices he had made. He reached out to those he had wronged in the past, including some of his employees and colleagues, offering heartfelt apologies and promising to be a better leader. But it wasn't just about words. Richard knew that to truly change, he had to prove it through his actions. He started investing in charitable causes, not as a way to look good in front of others, but because he genuinely wanted to make a difference. The biggest change came in his relationships. Richard began to connect with people on a deeper level, without the ego or the need for validation. He listened more, cared more, and tried to understand the struggles of others. For the first time, he found joy in giving without expecting anything in return. But the one thing that stuck with him the most was LeBron's simple yet profound advice. It's not about how much you have, it's about how you use it. Richard never forgot that moment. It became the foundation for his new way of living, one that was grounded in humility, empathy, and the desire to leave a positive impact on the world. As he looked back on everything, Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the humbling experience. It had taken a hard lesson to open his eyes, but now he was determined to be a better man, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. And as for LeBron, he continued to inspire Richard in ways he had never imagined, showing him that success is not defined by what you have, but by how much you give. This journey of self-discovery and growth was just the beginning for Richard, and he was ready to embrace it fully, with a heart that was open, humble, and ready to make a real difference. As the months went by, Richard's life slowly but steadily transformed. The changes he made weren't always easy, and at times he struggled to break free from the habits that had defined his past. But every day he made a conscious effort to be better, not just in his business, but as a person. He started working with organizations that supported underprivileged communities, using his wealth and influence to make a tangible impact. He created scholarships for students who wanted to pursue higher education, donated to hospitals, and helped fund projects aimed at reducing poverty. He didn't do it for the recognition, but because it felt right. He felt a deeper sense of purpose. Richard also began reconnecting with old friends and colleagues, people he had pushed away because of his arrogance. He listened to their stories, offered his support, and rebuilt relationships that had been damaged. The emptiness he had once felt was slowly replaced with a sense of fulfillment that came from helping others and living a life of integrity. But the most significant change was in his heart. He had let go of the need for validation and status. He had learned the true meaning of success, and it wasn't about how much you owned or how many people admired you. It was about how much you gave to the world and the positive impact you had on the lives of others. One evening, as Richard sat on the porch of his home, he thought about everything that had led him to this point. He thought about the night he had insulted LeBron, the humbling realization that followed, and the journey of self-discovery that had completely reshaped his life. He had started with an ego that was larger than life, but now he was a man who understood the value of humility, compassion, and purpose. Richard knew that his journey wasn't over, but he was ready for the next chapter, a new beginning. A beginning where he could be the man he was always meant to be. A man who inspired others, who made a difference, and who left a legacy not of wealth, but of love, kindness, and change. As Richard's journey unfolded, he began to realize that the real lesson wasn't just about the external changes, his wealth, his relationships, his social standing. It was about the internal shift he had experienced. The journey from arrogance to humility, from selfishness to service, had reshaped him in ways he could never have imagined. And the lesson, which had once been hidden in plain sight, had finally become clear. True success is not measured by what you have, but by what you give. Reflecting on everything that had transpired, Richard saw that the real turning point in his life had not been the moment he apologized to LeBron, but the moment he understood why he needed to change. It was the moment he recognized that his worth wasn't tied to his bank balance or the cars he drove, but to the lives he could touch and the positive difference he could make. The road to self-discovery hadn't been easy. It required him to confront his own pride, his own flaws, and his own misplaced values. But in doing so, Richard had learned to be a better man. He had learned to appreciate the quiet power of kindness, the strength in vulnerability, and the importance of using his resources to uplift others. LeBron had been the catalyst for Richard's transformation, but it wasn't LeBron's wealth, fame, or success that had inspired Richard. It was his humility, his generosity, and his unwavering commitment to making the world a better place. In the end, Richard learned that the most powerful form of success is the ability to make others feel valued, seen, and supported. As he moved forward, Richard knew that the impact of his transformation would continue to ripple out into the world. The people he had helped, the causes he had supported, the relationships he had rebuilt, these were the things that would endure long after the material possessions he had once cherished. The final takeaway? Success is not about accumulating wealth or accolades. It's about leaving a legacy that touches the hearts of others. It's about living a life that is authentic, meaningful, and driven by a purpose larger than oneself. And so, Richard's new beginning wasn't just the start of a new chapter for him. It was the beginning of a new way of seeing the world, a way that was focused on generosity, kindness, and making a difference. If this story has inspired you to change your perspective on what it truly means to succeed, don't forget to subscribe and follow along for more stories of transformation, growth, and the lessons that can change our lives.